Hello, Week Unwrappers. Imagine my voice not in your headphones, but actually in the same room. In fact, not just my dulcet tones, but also those of Rebecca Gilley, Jamie Timpson, and Holden Frith as well. Well, you can make that dream a reality, because on Sunday, April the 7th, we will be appearing live as part of the Podcast Live Politics show in central London. Come and watch a recording of the Week Unwrapped and then ask us all the questions you've been dying to ask. And you can even get a full day ticket if you want, with other great political podcasters doing sessions on the day, including Samira Ahmed, Ian Dale and Sophie Rich. For tickets, go to podcastlive.com, and if you put in week 10 at the checkout, WEEK10, you get a 10% discount on the ticket price. See you there. It's the week ending Saturday the 23rd of March, and this is the Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Theresa May asking the EU to postpone Brexit, Cyclone Idai becoming the worst storm to ever hit the Southern Hemisphere, and New Zealand announcing a ban on the sale of military-style weapons. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team are Kari, Wilkin, Hollie Clemence, and making his Week Unwrapped debut from Money Week, we welcome John Stepek. Hi, John.
Hi, Ollie. Nice to be here.
Nice to have you here, and I hope you're going to start us with an in-depth financial story. What have you got for us, John?
This week, we got a piece of incredibly good economic news from the UK, and nobody cared.
These are very disappointing figures that have been announced today. And every job that is lost is a tragedy for that person and for their family. And that is why this government is going to do everything it possibly can to help get people into work. That is why we have the work programme. That is why we have welfare reform, to make sure it pays for people always to be in work. That is why we're reforming our schools, including raising the participation age to 18. And that is why we have a record number of apprenticeships, 360,000 this year. But I accept we have got to do more to get our economy moving, to get jobs for our people. But we mustn't abandon the plan that has given us record low interest rates.
That was David, I want to say Cameron. What was his name again? I remember he had some significance. Speaking back in 2011, when unemployment rates were at a 17-year high. John, what's happened this week?
Well, this week we've learned that the UK employment rate has hit its highest level ever. So the employment rate is the proportion of people who are actually in jobs. Meanwhile, the unemployment rate has hit its lowest level since 1975. Meanwhile, job wages are going up as well.
You say that like those things aren't obviously correlated, unemployment and employment rates.
They are clearly correlated, but there's various different measures and there's various different kind of ways to look at the employment market. And one of the key things about the employment rate is that it's driven partly by lots of women being in the labour market as well, in a way that hasn't actually been the case. The unemployment rate is slightly different, and that is the proportion of people who are looking for jobs but can't get one.
But the criticism that you often hear whenever these accelerating employment rates are announced is, well, it's all very well, but actually if you speak to my constituents, they'll tell you that they're being pressured into all kinds of flexible freelance working that doesn't benefit them. They don't have more money in the bank. It's just they've been forced to go and get a job because their welfare's been cut. They have less money coming in. I mean, is it a good news story or not?
No, this is a great news story. Ultimately, the statistics show that the number of people in 0 hours contracts is down, the number of people in full-time work is up. I mean, there's no real question, unless you want to embark on a conspiracy theory, that unemployment data has improved and that we are in a good position. What I would kind of flag up is that this is not about the UK alone. And I think that the important thing to understand here is this isn't a UK story. If you look at global unemployment, then that's actually a 40-year low. So we're talking about...
But isn't it the case that unemployment in the UK at the current jobless rate of 3.9%, it's still way below the EU average of 6.5%. So it is a good news story for the UK in particular, isn't it?
Oh yeah, no, it's a great news story for the UK. But if you look at the US, unemployment is at below 4%. If you look at Germany, unemployment's at 3.2%. And they all measure it ever so slightly differently. But the point is not so much to get too bogged down in the statistics. It's the fact that this is as I say, it's a kind of global story.
I want to take issue with you dismissing the idea that we might want to indulge in a conspiracy theory. You've obviously never heard the show before. Holly, might there be reasons for this that are a bad news story, in fact?
Well, I was looking, it's a Guardian article, so the Guardian are probably likely to take issue with the government. But this theory that companies are hiring workers rather than investing in productivity boosting technology, and there's a warning that that's paving the way for weaker growth in future. So is this kind of, we're going to peak now? Is it potentially going to go downhill maybe after Brexit?
And that's a fact, isn't it? Structural investment is down.
Yes.
Those two figures are both out there.
Oh yeah, and I totally agree, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that argument.
But is there something wrong with the process? Valid. Let's talk about that so that listeners are clear. Structural investment is down. So what the argument in the article is saying is, therefore, companies are thinking, we do have cash flow, we do have orders, we're going to have to make everyone redundant in the future. We don't want to spend that money on machines we can't make redundant, so we'll employ people so that we can fire them.
Absolutely. So, I mean, this is it's an entirely fair argument. Investment in plant and all the rest of it is down. Again, though, this is actually a global issue. It's a conundrum, if you like. Everywhere in the world, Britain is particularly bad on it, but not uniquely bad, is wrestling with this idea of productivity. So productivity is basically how your standard of living goes up as a country. It's basically getting more out of less. And that's how you improve life in general, and that's the ultimate driver of economic growth. And the problem is that productivity is down everywhere. The question is, why do we have declining productivity? Why do we have almost full employment in lots of countries? And yet again, we don't have kind of wage inflation. You know, you'd expect inflation to be a real issue.
I mean, one answer to that, perhaps, Kari, is something we've discussed on the show before, to take the example of Uber, although you could substitute any digital disruptor here, but we've talked about Uber in the past. You know, they're sort of technically a minicab company, really. So it looks like there are more people employed as minicab drivers, but of course the reason for that is lots of people are doing that to subsidise, you know, being a student, for example, or doing it on top of another job. So it looks like lots of people employed. What it actually means is, for people that were minicab drivers, they're earning less money, and the Uber drivers are earning less money than minicab drivers used to too. Yeah,
when I saw these, the employment figures, obviously you welcome them, and as John says, clearly it is very good news, but I did wonder about the effects of the gig. That was my instant reaction, the effects of the gig economy in terms of all these jobs, you know, whether, as you say, whether people are just holding multiple jobs and therefore are not actually benefiting. So yes, I think these figures can be misleading in that companies have just found ways around giving, you know, the benefits, encouraging the productivity in the same way that you can argue that companies are just employing more people while avoiding making investments in the businesses. So they're sort of safeguarding themselves while offering far less to employees.
Holly.
Also, the number of people in retirement is at its lowest level for 25 years. So I guess you've got a lot of people that would otherwise be taking their pension and enjoying retirement that have had to probably stay into work because their ages are going up and they can't afford to not work.
And also the fact that people are living for longer, they get bored. You know, people are going back into the job market almost as a hobby, simply as something to do. So these aren't necessarily jobs that are sustaining people that necessarily need the income.
Why do you think, John, that this has been somewhat underreported? I mean, the figures are out there for everyone to see, but the idea that it's a good news story, even the cabinet don't really make a great song and dance about it, do they? Why is that? Are they just distracted by Brexit?
I mean, obviously they're distracted by Brexit. And it's not really a bad news story either, and bad news tends to get more headlines.
But is it also that fear, the uncertainty of what's going to happen with the B word? You know, there's like financial service companies have committed to move about 1 trillion worth of assets out of the UK into Europe. The British Chamber of Commerce this week downgraded its growth expectations for the UK in 2019 to 1.2%, which would be the weakest growth in a decade. And it's just like, is it not that no one wants to look a fool if things crash and then people turn around and go, well, you said it was really good.
And also, I suppose, because Brexit is happening, you know, we try and ignore it on this show and talk about other things, but it is happening, it is informing every news story that actually it's legitimate to say everything pales into insignificance compared to that. But if we are able to park it for a second, are you kind of saying, John, that, I mean, David Cameron won that election in 2015, didn't he, outright with a small Conservative majority? If Brexit hadn't happened, if he hadn't promised a referendum, if George Osborne and David Cameron were still running the economy, they actually, albeit they didn't hit their target first 5-year round, but that was in a coalition government, they actually were right?
Again, I think the real problem with this is that it's not a UK story. So what happened was we had a catastrophic financial crisis in 2008. Since then, the global economy has been gradually and very slowly recovering from that. And I think the vast majority of our both our problems and our turnaround as a globe basically have stemmed from that. So basically, yeah, if Cameron was still in charge, he'd be able to take credit for it, but it wouldn't be because of anything that he did. It's very easy to get tied into things like local politics whenever you're talking about things like employment. But actually, this is happening everywhere.
OK, John, you've proven your credentials talking about a financial story. That's maybe not a surprise. It is now the nature of the show, as you know, you're going to have to sit here and talk about two completely different things. Hollie's up next after this. OK, Hollie, it's your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
Should 30 be the new 18?
The feeling of being an adult is very personal. Like maybe for me, it's about owning a house. For other people, maybe having a children.
When I could afford to like live on an island by myself and have like a private jet and just go on holidays.
You know, I lost my hair at a very young age, so I think I became an adult when I started losing a lot of that, you know, kind of frontal area. So yes.
I pay rent. I go to the gym. I now look after my body.
A hip young video there from Bloomberg. You can see the whole thing on their TikTok Twitter feed. Hollie, what's the story?
So this week, brain researchers said our hard definitions of adulthood are looking increasingly absurd. So like the judicial system says that we're an adult at 18, but they say our brains are going through significant developments well into our 30s.
But that doesn't mean we're not an adult, does it? I mean, our brains change all the way up to death, don't they?
Well, does it? This is my question. No, to mature your brain, it's gone through all the developments that it needs to go through into your 30s.
So essentially the point at which it hasn't started declining yet.
You could say that.
Okay.
It's reached a level where you're less likely to kind of behave with risky behaviours, or you're more likely to take in the consequences of your actions. The things that we think about teenagehood, we should be thinking perhaps into your 20s as well.
Okay, fascinating. I know you're not a scientist, but can you give us some of the science that they've looked at to reach this conclusion?
This is taken from The Independent. Processes that involve boosting the conductivity of nerves, building neural networks, and pruning away unwanted connections. So that begins when you're conceived in the womb, and then it carries on, and you would think until 18, but actually it goes on until much later, so it's like 3 decades.
So you said 30 in your little tease into the story. Is that the age that they say you're fully...
Well, they're saying there is no cliff edge where you're suddenly an adult and you're...
Well, that's really helpful for legislation, isn't it?
Exactly. That's the problem. We have to pick an age for law, but if you take it into account, it's just got so many implications, the way we look at things. There are some things that I think it should have a fundamental effect on. For example, how we deal with mental health is very different. How we deal with children, and then they go into adulthood and it suddenly changes. And how we put people into prison, for example, or youth centres. There's lots of things that it actually could have a real impact on.
Kari, do you think there should be a change in law to reflect this kind of scientific research?
I mean, I think it's very difficult because age definitions are always arbitrary. You know, for example, drinking ages, 61% of the world's countries have a legal minimum drinking age of 18 and 19. But, you know, it varies all across the board and it can only ever be a very loose guideline. But yes, I do think it needs to be a factor in criminal responsibility. I mean, the researchers did make the point that an experienced judge will take into account the fact whether the defendant in front of them is 18 or, you know, a 30-year-old hardened criminal. So you could say that there are sort of unspoken rules that are already recognised. But it does seem harsh to be judging people who, as Hollie said, their brain may not have developed to an extent where they are capable of making what we would call more rational decisions. Countries such as New Zealand, they already treat children who've been in care and are there more likely to be disturbed and to perhaps end up in the criminal justice system. They treat them as vulnerable until they're 25. So they're kind of recognising that, which will then tie into the legal system. And
John, actually in your world, in finance, this is recognised. You mentioned the minimum wage earlier, didn't you? There's a different minimum wage threshold, isn't there? Is it 21? I think it is.
Yeah, well, and actually 25.
25. So that's to reflect experience in business, I guess. That's the argument. But you could say it's to do with maturity as well. People would expect to be earning more once they've become more established. Should that be reflected elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's actually a really interesting point that Kari made about the New Zealand criminal justice system. One thing that I find interesting, though, is that, for example, the recognition of teenagers as a separate entity, if you like, is a very recent thing in itself. And I certainly know that my grandparents didn't really have anything you would kind of recognisably kind of view as a teenagehood. And I do wonder if it's just a function of us almost extending teenagehood into our 20s as much as... I recognise, obviously there is a brain biology factor at work, but I wonder if recognising that is also to do with essentially having an extended childhood.
I think there is a risk of telling anyone in their 20s you can behave like a teenager. That's probably not a good thing.
Half a generation can't move out of their parents' houses because they can't afford to. So, how can you expect people to grow up?
I think there's a sort of tension, though, with reproductive systems where girls starting puberty 5 years earlier than a century ago. So there's this feeling, I would say, that children look and act like they're older when they're younger now than maybe our parents' generation would say. So that is at odds with this idea that your brain's not ready to be that old.
Yeah, I mean, that's the sort of strange thing about biology, isn't it? I mean, that is our bodies doing their work to reproduce basically when you are mentally irresponsible but physically ready.
Yeah.
And the law can't reflect that, really. I mean, that's the law of nature, isn't it?
Exactly. There's an interesting statistic as well about baby boomers in America had the youngest age of first marriages, but then there was a peak in divorce after that. So there's this kind of correlation between people getting married young, and maybe there is, if you're scientifically not ready to choose the right spouse, perhaps there is a reason to relook at ages of marriage, of voting. But at the same time, it happens when there's big discussion about letting 16-year-olds vote. I guess it all comes down to what difference does it make if your brain isn't responsible? Can you still have a say in how the country's run? You could be sent to war, for example, at 18, but if we decide you're not ready for that, it would have a huge implication.
Yeah, what's your view on that, Holly? Because you've talked before about having a military component to your family on the show. What's your view on that? Because Britain's one of the only countries in the world that still has child soldiers. You can be enlisted into the British Army when you're 16, even though you don't fight till 18. Should that be 21?
I'm not actually against it. Maybe the 18 age, because 16 you can't be on the front line. And I think there's a lot of people that I've come across that maybe wouldn't have had such a good life if they hadn't have joined the army. And 16 is an age where you could easily go off the rails, and there's lots of people that have made a career for themselves. Yes, going straight into war at 18 must be horrendous, and I imagine you're far more likely to have PTSD and other things if you see terrible things at that age. So maybe that's something to take into consideration, whether you're actually on the front line.
But the very decision to join the army being taken at 16, we're now saying, well, maybe you're not in charge of your own destiny, really. But I suppose that could go for any career, couldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, 16 is young, but also you're kind of in the college of army. You're not necessarily seeing as much as you would be at 18.
It does seem insane that you can choose to go into the army and fight for your country at 16, but you can't vote to decide who's going to rule your country at 16.
Yeah.
And I do think one concern with these kind of studies is that, yes, age definitions are always going to be arbitrary, but the argument that current definitions of adolescence are overly restricted. But on the other hand, that could risk disenfranchising adolescents and undermining their rights, at a time when, as Holly was saying, there's a massive campaign in the UK, people calling for the vote, the legal age of voting to be reduced to 16. So I think we have to be very careful not to end up infantilising everybody.
What John was saying, I think the more responsibility sometimes you give younger people, they probably will grow up quicker anyway. I mean, there's Caesar was in charge at 16 and Joan of Arc, they were all doing great things as teenagers, and it hasn't stopped people in the past from kind of doing adult things.
And John, the government
age.
currently wants smoking to be prohibited until you're 21.
Yeah, there was a report from MPs this week saying about raising the smoking age to 21. And the other problem is it's really just using another policy to distract from the fact that what you really want to do, like if you don't think people should be smoking, then just come out and say it. Just say it, ban it, whatever you want to do.
Is it like Hawaii recently talked about? Was it Hawaii talked about raising the legal smoking age to 100? It's like, at least just be honest about what you're doing.
Exactly.
Is there something else going on here, which is, in the 18th century, the average life expectancy was 35 years. So are we really talking about adult here, or are we talking about another stage in our evolution?
Was that not largely down to child mortality law?
But that's how it's been through history, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think average lifespans are likely to get longer. So yes, maybe there will be more compartments to life. Maybe you've still got the problem of reproductive systems. Unless we can find a way to have children much later in life, you're still going to need to have children maybe at a younger age than you're mature enough to.
But this level of maturity, people now say, I didn't feel like an adult till I was 30. People didn't live much beyond 35. So, it's actually, this feeling of adulthood might be unique to our generation
so
in the developed world.
Yeah. But then, maybe we'll reach a whole sort of new level of the brain, although the fact that your brain then starts dying from about the age of the 30s, I suppose, kind of hinders that a bit.
Well, that's the other thing, isn't it, John? I know from some of the feedback we get on Twitter to this show that there'll be people who are over 50, say, listening to this conversation right now, thinking that since we are all under 50, we all sound like children. I mean, is it just the natural condition of age that as you get older, you become wiser or think you do? So if you ask people, when did you become an adult, they'll always say something reasonably close to their age now.
I mean, I think that's a good point. And also, I mean, you're right. If anybody had asked me, are you an adult, when I was 21, I'd have said, well, I guess, So it is a bit of a... it's kind of difficult to put a date or an actual age on it.
Well, I am going to ask you that very question now, like it or not. When did we all feel like we'd become adults, John?
I would have been 28, and that is basically when my first child was born. And from that point I sort of felt, oh man, this is now serious. That's basically what the feeling was. And parenthood is just one mistake after another. So yeah.
And Kari, would you pin it on parenthood as well?
Yeah, parenthood, I'd say.
So which age are we talking?
Oh God.
Come on.
33.
33, okay. And Holly?
My sister always says you're an adult when you can have alcohol in the house and not drink it all in one go. That hasn't happened yet, so I'm still waiting.
Okay. One last story to come after this. And so, finally this week, it is Kari's turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
I think this is the week we ask, it's Myspace, but who keeps the content?
Over the years, Myspace has hosted more than 53 million songs. Many bands used to use the social media website to spread their music, but the site says it lost a dozen years' worth of tunes in a server migration. In a sign of the site's decreasing relevance, it made the admission 7 months ago, and it took this long for word to spread.
That was WPLG's Local 10 reporting on Myspace's recent faux pas. Kari, recap the story for us. 12 years worth of music and other media.
Yep, it's quite a lot. So basically, Myspace this week, they've finally apologised after confirming that, yes, 12 years worth of music, photos and videos uploaded to the once mighty social network had been lost during a server migration project about more than a year ago, actually. But as they said on the clip, it's only just sort of been confirmed. Obviously, a lot of people are very angry. Some pundits are claiming that possibly it wasn't entirely accidental and that the firm, which was purchased by Time Inc. in 2016, actually was just wanting to dodge the effort and cost of migrating and hosting these massive amounts of data. And it's raised a lot of questions just about, where all this data goes and who is looking after it.
This story has been widely reported, though, so what have you picked out in it that you think hasn't had the exposure it deserves?
There have been comparisons made with other early internet communities that closed down and deleted huge swaths of online history. And I think it's raised a lot of interesting questions about, in this digital age, what is going to archive this century? Are we going to be left with this just massive black hole of where all this information and this data has just disappeared? This week, actually, a group of volunteers announced that they're working to preserve posts from the failed social network Google Plus before it closes down in April.
I mean, when people post up to social media sites, there's a growing anxiety that it'll be seen for future generations. That's why people like networks like Snap. But then when you take away their data from 10 years ago that they haven't listened to for 10 years anyway, they're up in arms saying, I used to love that song. So what's the happy medium?
I think the problem is you just have to take responsibility for your own data. I do worry about this because I use Evernote, Dropbox, Gmail, all of these things, and there is stuff on there that if it got lost, you'd be like, oh no. So I think the only thing you can do about it is have your photos and any important documents backed up on a hard drive somewhere. But also, if something's really important, you need to print it out. The other issue is the question of coding and languages going out of date. So stuff that you had on your computer 10 years ago is now essentially inaccessible unless you get a specialist company to come in and, take it out or take it off. I remember when things were on discs. It's like, what do you do with a floppy disk anymore?
There's actually a very good article this week in the New Statesman by Sarah Dittam, and she talks about holes in the internet. But she does say anything that exists only in digital format is just one technological change or server disaster from disappearing into nothing. And I think we all have got this misplaced sense that digitalization means forever. I mean, I know I use Gmail as a form of filing system because I'm like, well, it's safe there. But it's not, as she makes that point. And I think that's something that we've overlooked.
And these companies, Holly, they are private companies. Facebook, Apple, Google. Okay, I suppose you could argue that when you pay for a particular part of their service, like iCloud, for example, you're entering into a contract, you're paying them to keep your files. Maybe you could sue them if they lost them. But they're a private company. If they decide to stop offering a service, it was your fault for entrusting it to them, wasn't it? You don't have any data yourself.
There is an argument, Clash magazine made it this week, talking about nationalising streaming services, which is a quite out there argument, I suppose, and people made similar calls last year in the Facebook scandal, just saying that it's become such a critical part of our infrastructure and it's so important to people's livelihoods. Some people it's your job if you sell things on Facebook, for example, or the only way of contacting your families on Facebook. It is really integral to people's lives. Should states be in charge of that? I find that a little bit scary. If the government could read all my private Facebook messages, I think I'd rather it be in the hands. Exactly.
It's also shocking how easy it is actually to make the inadvertent decision to delete stuff digitally. I mean, I've got a couple of WordPress blogs and they're literally one button push away and, 12 years worth of archive would evaporate. I could do that if I was drunk one night trying to edit the site. There's probably some way of emailing someone and asking them, can I have it back? But, it's free. I press the button.
Even if you're trying very hard to preserve this, it's very difficult. And there was another great article in Pitchfork this week, just saying about how you can basically jump from file to file, but it as John was saying, it all just becomes defunct very, very quickly. And it gave a great example of the Doomsday Book. The original, produced in 1086, is still in existence. Historians can still read it. And yet 900 years later, in 1986, the BBC decided to produce a digital update of the Doomsday Book, and they recorded it onto 2 laser discs in a Philips format. And by 2002, they could no longer be opened, these files, and they still have managed to properly recapture all of the content. So, that is terrifying. Even if you think you're on top of it, where are you putting this? Unless it's good old-fashioned paper.
It's bad news for trees, really.
Yeah.
If everyone's going to suddenly print out everything, imagine printing out everything on your Gmail. I mean, I've still got Hotmail. It's probably Outlook now. But for years and years and years, because that's just ended up being my email, the thought of printing that out would be a forest.
Holly, would you be happy to have your past self removed from the internet? Or would you mourn the opportunity to look back at this snapshot of your former life?
I think when I heard this, I did kind of have a relief, feeling of relief that it would all disappear. Not for myself. I think I can bear to look back myself, but it would be quite nice to know that nobody else could. But then there was kind of a more serious side to it. There was a father who had memories of his son playing guitar at 7 and his son had passed away. Like, there are serious consequences to it, not just everybody's silly pages. But I guess, like John says, you need to keep those memories somewhere safe.
I mean, as a podcaster for many years, there are literally hundreds of hours of me talking that I'm embarrassed by that are publicly accessible. So I've stopped worrying about it. But you don't have to tell us where to find it, but do you have material of yourself online that you actually would much rather went away, that you are embarrassed by, that you wish wasn't there?
I wish I'd just never entered the whole social media thing. Not because it's particularly embarrassing, but I just sort of think, why did I bother? It's just like, I'd want my digital career, as in writing, whatever, preserved, not because it's particularly wonderful, but just because that's what I've done. It's what I've worked towards. But yeah, I'd be quite happy for my whole Facebook and everything to disappear. It's added nothing to the world.
John, I imagine that all your behaviour online has been beyond reproach for over a decade.
Absolutely. Yeah, nothing unprofessional in any of my profiles anywhere. Just follow me at Twitter, John_Stepek.
Well, thank you very much. A very promising debut, John, on the show. If people actually do want to find you, do a Money Week podcast as well.
Yes, we do. Just go to the moneyweek.com website, and that's me talking to the much more eloquent and clever Merrin Somerset Webb, who is our editor-in-chief.
And again, completely unimpeachable back catalogue, I'm sure, full of pure professionalism through and through. He's laughing. That is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to John, but also, of course, to Kari and to Holly. You will be thrilled, I'm sure, to hear that our entire archive remains on the internet in its entirety. If we ever pull the plug, make sure you've saved copies so that we can re-upload it in the future for posterity. You can discover it when you subscribe to The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice. And away from the virtual world, you can come and see us in real life by coming to Podcast Live on the 7th of April. There are still tickets available. You can still use your discount. Full details and discounts at podcastlive.com. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week. Bye-bye.